This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Jay-Z Microphones, PreSonus, Spectra 1964, and API Audio. So get ready to rock.
It might sound really weird to you, what they've sent you, but there's no doubt that it has a musicality and a feel that they identify with. And sound is fragile, and feel is durable. If you get the feel right, it will carry through the worst playback systems.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. If you feel like the fast pace of computer tech has made your studio Mac obsolete, then think again. OWC is your personal studio tech for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs perfect for recording and mixing. Why ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio far into the future with the Mac you've already got? Learn how to supercharge your studio and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC.com so that you can focus on making great music. If you want a digital audio workstation that will give life to your music, from sketching a new idea to composing, editing, mixing, and mastering a finished record, then you want Studio One from PreSonus. Studio One is easy to use with intuitive drag-and-drop simplicity, making it great for beginners yet flexible and powerful for experienced producers. Whether creating beats, recording a band, or composing a blockbuster film soundtrack, you will find everything you need to create your masterpiece. Download your free version of Studio One Prime and get started now at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Chuck Zwicky, a mixer, engineer, writer, and producer in Manhattan. He's built studios, designed plugins, and recorded, mixed, and mastered hit records. His credits include artists like Prince, the Rembrandts, Reggie Watts, Soul Asylum, 9 Inch Nails, the Jonas Brothers, and many, many more. He has a private mix room in his home in Manhattan, and I actually recently met Chuck at the AES show in the fall of 2019 when he was doing a presentation for Eventide, showing off some amazing ninja tips for the H9000 Harmonizer. And so I went up and said hello, and I wanted to invite him to be on the show because I was very curious about his work. And Chuck turned around and recognized my voice, and he said, "I know who you are," because I was walking up from behind. So very excited to have Chuck here on the show. We're actually doing this at a very, very unusual time. This is right in the month of March of 2020. So you're going to be hearing this episode many months after we were all going through the coronavirus lockdown, COVID-19. So we'll be talking about that a little bit in hindsight. And I'm just excited to be able to connect with somebody from here in my home studio. Chuck Zwicky, welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. Are you ready to rock, man?
Thanks, Lid. Certainly.
It's great to have you here. And I suppose as everybody who's listening can imagine, we spent a good while just talking before we even started the interview about what's going on right now. And there's so much to say, and there's so much to say about making records too. But tell us where you are right now and where you're joining us from.
Speaking to you from my studio in Manhattan, where I've been since 2001, and looking at my piles of outboard gear and dozens of pieces of acoustical treatment that I've been tweaking since I got here. The acoustics in this space are pretty near perfect for the space. Just everything's symmetrical, everything sounds good. And lucky for me, I'm working from home. It's sort of, don't have to commute, don't have to break the lockdown.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was thinking about that myself too. My work is already from home, and I imagine many of our listeners also have studios where they're, maybe it's in their home or it's nearby. And, how do you feel like some of this has affected your ability to work right now?
Well, self-isolation is my default mode. And I've been working essentially with unattended mixes for decades. So to me, it doesn't feel that different until I get someone on the phone and they're talking about their gig's canceled. They can't do this thing, can't do that. And I'm sort of like, oh yes, things are very different out there for people who don't have the luxury of just having their own, autonomous, sort of work schedule where they can dictate when and how they're working. They have I have a list of projects that I'll go through every day. So for me, it's kind of, I'm already in the most sort of highly unaffected workspace.
Yeah, exactly. Same with me too. And it's one of those things where it's like, I could go to work and do what I need to do, but the people who send us a mix to work on might be heavily, heavily affected.
Right.
I mean, everybody is in Nashville in the music world. All the performing musicians are live streaming, trying to figure out what to do next, reaching out through social media to each other. And it's also at this point that I think we all distinctly feel the desire for the internet to somehow make us feel like we can play music together in real time. And that's one of the topics you and I talked about just before this call too. Mm-hmm. You wanted to explain a little bit about how that's not possible or why that doesn't really work the way we imagine it should.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. We're dealing with networks which send data in ways that are convenient to the network and are, so we experience latency and different kinds of latency. So even now, I mean, anybody that's had, an argument with their girlfriend or significant other on a cell phone has realized that it's due to some communication issue that they're not aware is technology. So specifically latency. Yeah. And we can prove how much or demonstrate how much latency we have. For example, I'm going to count to 4 in a regular rhythmic way. And when you hear me utter 4, you say it right on top of that beat.
All right. And I'll preface it by saying, Rockstars, we're talking now over Skype between Nashville and New York City.
Yeah. And then when I finish that, you count to 4 and I'll say 4 when I predict you're going to say 4 as well.
All right.
So here we go.
So wait, you're going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to say 4 when you say 4?
Yeah. You're going to catch the rhythm and try to hit right on that, right?
I'm the guy in the band that needs right. 3 extra explanations before we go. Okay.
We're going to punch you in on the 4.
Do you have a chart, man? Could you just email me over a quick chart?
Do you want me to write the lyrics down for you?
Yeah. Thanks.
It's 4. All right. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
All right. So now for me, it sounded like I said 4 right on time.
Sure.
Maybe I'm a little bit lazy. I'm kind of a laid back dude.
Sure.
But it should have been right on time. But I think, what did you hear?
I heard 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.
Well, that's pretty good timing too. That was just an extra quarter note there.
Well, you count 4.
How do you know I wasn't beat juggling, dude?
Exactly. Don't worry, I fixed it. Why don't you count to 4, and I'll say 4 right when you do.
I'm getting the feel, man. I'm getting the tempo. What tempo do we want? 1, 2, 3, 4.
4.
Oh yeah, man. You came in you were like a dotted, quarter note or something after me.
Sure. It's quite a significant amount of delay.
Yeah. And what that means is that unfortunately we can't sing together. I think all we have to do right now is just clap together. Here, let's try that. Oh boy.
Wow, that's horrible.
Boy. Hand that guy an ice cream cone.
Yeah, keep his hands busy.
So that doesn't work at all. And it's such a bummer because when you want to play music and write with people or even just write a song together, you realize you have to just take turns. Now, I will say that I started Googling again, and there are, there are some things that still claim to let people, quote, jam together on the internet. And as you probably know as well as I do, that promise has been around since the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
So there was originally something called the Rocket Network, which promised to let us all jam together and build a social media connection and all this stuff. The reason they never take off is because the tech just isn't there.
Yeah, and it pretty much never will be. I mean, even networked audio interfaces like AES-67, Dante, can have similar problems. Not as drastic, but I went to 2 days of Dante networking seminars at the AES just to get an answer to a question that none of the manufacturers could answer. And my own testing gave me very disappointing results, which is over networked audio, is it possible to have latency that is consistent and deterministic? In other words, every time you boot your system, is it exactly the same amount of latency or does it change?
Wow.
That's a tough one, right?
And that's when you would just assume, everybody listening would assume, well, of course, of course, it should be the same latency every time.
And it isn't. And like, I know that on OS X, USB interfaces will have a different latency every time you boot them up or change the sample rate, as I've tested. Now, I've heard that on the PC end, that's not the problem. They've fixed that so you can have consistent latency. But it used to sort of throw me when I would work on something, say on just a simple setup, just let's throw in an overdub, and it's like, that doesn't feel like what I played. Check it out, and it's like, oh yeah, it's different. It's off.
Wow. So what you discovered is that a simple USB interface plugged into a Mac, even though we see numbers like 32, 64, 128, there's another level of latency happening there that's never consistent every time you open up your DAW and plug it in and go?
Well, yeah, those numbers are the buffer setting, right? And that determines how much memory the computer is using to process whatever audio. So if you have low buffer settings, you might get crackles and pops because it's too much, right? Too much data.
Right.
Now, you can measure the latency like by sending a click track out and recording it back in, or if you have an insert, like there's a DAW on OS X called Logic, which has an I/O plugin, which allows you to send signals out to an interface and back in. So when you want to interface your outboard gear. And I worked with Apple, because I use Logic, I've been using it forever, to allow the latency to be determined by that plugin. So they put a button in that's called ping, which allows you to tell in the number of samples how long it's taking to get out and come back in. Now that compensates automatically when you're using outboard gear in Logic with that ping function. But when you're recording, the interface still has, half that much latency getting from the interface to the computer and or whatnot.
On the way in other words.
Yeah, and plus also what the computer thinks it's playing versus it's now being sent through a little level of delay before you hear it. You're playing along with something that the computer thinks, it sent it out, 15 milliseconds ago, but you're playing to the thing you're hearing 15 milliseconds later.
Yeah.
So your performance is now behind the beat. So that's another thing that needs to be tested for, because you may wonder, why is my part, lagging behind? It feels really late. It's like I was playing right on top of the click as I was hearing it. So these things need to be tested. Most people just assume it's perfect and fix it later. I've worked with a lot of artists where we just record something and then line it up manually. Like, okay, that's definitely off from where we played it, but let's just line it up, move the whole track. Stuff to know about. Logic has a parameter in the preferences called recording delay, which goes in positive and negative numbers, I think up to like 100 samples either direction. And allows you to compensate for whatever your interface is doing, and you can get it spot on. Pro Tools does not have that.
So you would, how would you even set that up?
Record a click. Just record the click track, plug the headphone output, say into that audio interface. Record that click on a track, or have a recorded click, say audio file click. Feed that out in your headphones, plug the headphone, jack into the input of your interface, record that, and then look at the audio as the file, the regions that are created by the recording, and you'll see the discrepancy in time.
So in other words, the click was generated by the plugin of Logic, or generated by Logic.
By your DAW, yeah.
By your DAW. And then it records into a track, so now you have a recording of the click, and then you play that click out and record it back into a new track.
Well, you don't even have to go that far. I mean, you would use anything that's regular, whatever, if you have a virtual instrument, but if you have an audio track that has something on it, it'll just give you a visual reference. And then, of course, another way to determine that, if you can take the click, this is going to confuse people.
No, that's what we're here for, man. We'll go straight to the bottom of this.
Okay, great. So imagine you just want to turn on the metronome, the click in your DAW, and then you plug, turn the input monitoring off so you don't get a feedback loop, and just record the output of your headphones, straight into the input, record that on a track, and then you're listening back and you're hearing the click flamming with the click generated by the DAW.
Now, let's clarify that. So the rock stars might think they're holding their headphone up to their mic. Is that what you're saying in this case?
You could just plug a guitar cable from the headphone jack into the input. Either way. I mean, a microphone, holding the headphones up to the microphone might be just fine too, but it's a little less precise because there's, microphones and headphones don't have full frequency response, so the click might be a little
different shape or
different something. But yeah, you'll have a difficult time getting the thing to phase. So basically, once you've got the click recorded in, you're going to hear it flamming. You can plug like a sample offset delay plugin, which exists in most DAWs, and move that file until it stops flamming. And then it'll tell you like, okay, that was 17 samples or 130 samples or something. Then you just go into your recording delay, adjust it back 113 samples, repeat the process. Now turn off your plug-in delay that you added to calculate that. Turn that off and just make sure that it's recording where you expect it to be. It's a little geeky, I realize. And I've been sort of on Apple for several years to just, can we verify this and automate this process so that the end user doesn't have to go through this calibration, because most of them just won't.
Yeah. And I think what you're describing is that if every time we start our computer, the input latency of the interface taking an actual recording and turning it into digital, put it into your DAW, if that's never consistent, if it's always varying slightly, then every time you start your session before you record, you need to run this test, is what you're saying.
If it's not consistent, yeah. So what I've discovered now, years ago, this was a problem in early versions of OS X with any FireWire interface. And if you had a FireWire interface, the latency would be indeterminate. It would change every time. And Apogee discovered this, and they rewrote the part of OS X that handles audio over FireWire. So the workaround was that you would download a driver for an Apogee interface you didn't use called the Ensemble, and you would install it. Wow. And it would fix that problem. And then Apple got on the ball and they kind of fixed that thing. So, I work very closely with the programmers at Apple who work on Logic, and slowly these things get ironed out. In my case, I use an interface that doesn't rely on USB or FireWire. It runs on a PCI card, and the latency is absolutely dead on every time I reboot, which is essential because I use so much outboard gear and it's all latency compensated.
And what is the PCI card and interface you like to use?
I'm just using a Motu PCI E424. I've recently shuffled around my interfaces. At this point, I have like 78 channels of I/O in my studio.
Right, because you got that many musicians in your...
All of my musicians are little pieces of rack gear that need to be included on every session. I tend not to use plugins in my mixes, but
I'm pretty sure that the CDC guideline now is no more than 10 tracks on one session.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice?
Sorry. So Rockstar's combination of, keeping things a little light to keep us, encouraged, and at the same time recognizing the real severity of where we all are back in March when this is recorded. So I want to extend to anybody out there just as much love and well wishes as possible in case you're going through anything, or anybody you know or love is directly affected by this. I mean, we all are, but anyway. I'm not really an expert at words for this kind of thing, but just know that we're very seriously thinking about all of you. You want the critical details from your microphone to get through to your recording, and the Spectra 1964 101 amplifier provides just that, with unequaled headroom, low noise, and a linear output irrespective of transient audio peaks. Used by Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, and The Record Plant on records by ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, and John Lennon, Spectra 1964 brings that same incredible sound to your studio with the new STX 600 mic pre with built-in comp limiter. Start making classic records again at Spectra1964.com. Are you sick of microphones that make your music sound harsh and brittle? The new Amethyst mic by Jay-Z Microphones brings you a rich, warm tone with perfect detail using the golden capsule technology. Resulting from 30 years of microphone design, the Amethyst is hand-built using carefully selected parts with Class A discrete circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and an advanced shock mount to make sure your recordings sound awesome. This is my voice on the Amethyst right now. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the Amethyst mic at jzmic.com. So yes, so 78 inputs, very low latency with the Mo2. And what was the Mo2 interface again?
Well, I have, it's an older Mo2 system that is based on their PCI 424 card, which has the ability to run these I/O interfaces off of it. But it's a PCI based thing, so it doesn't use a serial data bus like USB or FireWire or any of those things to so that there's no change in latency. So, for example, I have, like I said, 78 channels of I/O that are sending signal while I mix, out to any number of pieces of outboard gear, compressors, actually hardware delays, things like that, H9000s, things like that. And every time I recall my sessions, everything's exactly as I left it. So it's, the latency hasn't changed. The send and return levels are what I program into that. So I have a kind of a novel setup.
Yeah. Well, it's just a cool reminder. I know one of the things about you and your studio, which we should give you a chance to describe it to us, is you have a lot of outboard gear. And so all your inputs are needed because that gives you the ability to keep all that stuff patched in and usable all the time, right?
That's right. Yeah. It's basically dedicated. So I have I'm not using necessarily 78 channels of outboard on each mix, but they are dedicated. Like I'll have, for example, an LA3 that I would like to use on this instrument. It's just something I then insert in the channel strip in Logic. So, and the way I've got it all set up is I have it's kind of like my sister was telling a story the other day about how someone's trying to chop down a tree and it's taking them hours and hours and hours. And someone said, well, why don't you sharpen your axe? Because no, I gotta get this tree down. Don't have time. And so, I've spent a lot of time calibrating my setup so that when I'm in the mode of working, I don't have to think about, is that latency different? Is that recalling exactly where I'd had it? So kind of preparing yourself before whatever you do in audio, whatever you're going to do in recording. Yeah.
I like your analogy. It reminds me of, it could also be tune your axe, right?
Tune your axe, but don't use a clip-on tuner. People will mock you in LA.
Oh no, that's terrible. I love my clip-ons. I love my snarks, even though I also hate them because they're junk.
Yeah.
But I just buy them and just can't have enough of those around. Do you remember, it's funny because we live in a time now where there's fewer tuners around. It sort of depends on the session, but in Nashville, tuners kind of disappeared for a while because everybody had an iPhone and they would just use the tuner in that.
Sure.
But originally it was like, you had to go buy a dedicated tuner and then you hand it around and you plug into it. And I don't remember thinking that the mics worked very well on them. Usually you wanted to plug your DI of your acoustic into the tuner, right?
Yeah, usually because inevitably if it was one of those sessions, there's 12 other people fiddling around while you're trying to tune.
Right, that. And then also there was the whole thing where it was like, you really need to all use the same tuner and pass it around.
I remember that. Yeah. People used to say that, but it's funny because it's one of my favorite observations producer Brian Eno was talking about the two things he thinks ruined music, especially in the early 1980s. And he credited digital guitar tuners and mix automation as the two things that ruined music. And he said, because pitch is such an individual thing and everybody tends to hear pitch in a different way, that you could readily identify any guitar player within a few notes just by hearing the way that their guitar was tuned. And I noticed that early on. Like I could always pick out, oh, that's so-and-so. He's always got that G string slightly sharp and he doesn't even hear it that way. It was
wow.
Like, yeah. So he said homogenizing that made people less distinctive.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I also remember my piano tuner once told me, there were different piano tunings you could choose from. I'm like, what? I thought you just come and tune the piano. He's like, well, no, you've got like, I can't remember all the names, but there was like a perfect tuning. And, there was a tuning that certain artists would choose because it actually made all the guitars sound more in tune for C and G, things like that. And then there's the extended tuning on a piano where the low notes, I think, get stretched out a little bit more to sound in tune. And it's fascinating. And the deeper you go in that world, you begin to realize that, you just begin to understand that tuning is something, maybe it's something natural and inherent, but it's also something that we're just trained for,
Yeah, I've seen people who will, sort of pull notes on an instrument like a guitar into a certain range no matter what they do. And I think that's a big part of training as a musical being, is trying to understand how to make those things work. There's a great story about Jeff Beck, who is a phenomenal musician and a phenomenal human being. And I was lucky to be able to work with him on a record. Yeah, he was awesome. And to hang out with him after the sessions and talk about all these things was just phenomenal, because he's just such a great guy. Anyway, story was that when he was originally in the Yardbirds, the singer of the band, Chris Dreja, I think is his name, had terrible stage fright, like was just petrified moments before they'd have to go up on stage. And so Jeff Beck is standing behind him. They're waiting to go up the steps onto the stage. And he taps him on the shoulder. And as he turns around, Jeff randomly grabbed the tuning pegs on his guitar and just started turning them randomly. And the singer's freaking out like, oh my God, you just detuned your guitar and we're just about to go on stage. And he said he did it just to kind of Jeff Beck did that to get the singer's mind off of his own nervousness by sort of making it collapse by overwhelming him. But he said to his credit, he didn't play a single note out of tune the entire night.
He just played it in tune anyway. He just bent it to where it needed to be.
That's what he does. If you've ever listened to him play, he plays guitar more like a singer than any guitarist I've ever known, where he approaches a note in a different way each time. He'll play the same 4-note melody, but each time he approaches a note, he's descending from above or bending up into it or turning it into something the way a singer might do it. So his training, and this is important to people who work these days in the recording studio where they're dealing with a lot of automatable, recallable computer, originated stuff like plugins and DAWs. He learned how to use his instrument in a way that was intimately familiar to him, that he knew just by his touch how much to bend that note, strike the note, would it be in tune? And that just takes a lot of repetition and a lot of practice. And so when you're working within a DAW, a lot of people have this habit of sort of calling up lists of presets, or I've heard stories about people when they are given a song to mix, they'll just start loading up the channel strips with plugins and other things without ever having to sort of feel their way through it, get an understanding of what it may or may not need. But you never get good at anything except through repetition.
Right. So it's almost like you need to get your finger on that track and feel it before you start knowing what plugins to put on and how to start tweaking them.
Yeah, and I think that one of the important things, for example, about me having sort of grown up in the world of hardware is just you get a physical connection to the equipment. Like there's an EQ that sits in front of me that I've used my entire life, and I can literally, with my eyes closed, listen to something and turn the knobs, even with it in bypass, knowing where it's going to be and what I'm going to hear from it when I when I insert it. But that just takes a lot of practice and a lot of time. And it's sort of like that sharpens your axe in another way. Like, what are you listening for? What are you hearing in this? What are you going to change in that, rather than just, here's a list of vocal EQ presets. Let me see which one of these sounds best on this track. It's kind of what...
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. And I remember studying guitar. And by the way, you've worked with some great guitar players. So I'm definitely going to want to talk to you about that a little bit. But you've done some really, really magnificent jazz guitar players as well. And I remember studying that jazz and being really fascinated. But I mean, I didn't study jazz deeply. I was more of like learning to play guitar and a real fan of jazz. And I would, ask about great players. And it's like, do they not have to think about where they're going to go find that note and play that part? Do they just hear it in their head and their fingers just do what they're doing? And it seemed so magical and distant to me at the time. Now it seems pretty obvious to me that, like, yeah, of course, you just, like, the more you play, the more you just kind of get it and begin to hear it and begin to know what to do.
But isn't that an amazing discovery?
Yeah.
I remember as a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, learning how to play the guitar, listening to some of I have an older brother who's 6 years older than me, and his taste in music was even beyond his years. So he's always had these really interesting records. And I remember listening to them and literally asking myself the question, how do they know which note to go to?
Right.
Because I just didn't have the concept of what that was like. And as a adult musician, you're like, well, you just have this intuition of what you're going to express, how you're going to get there, and the notes just come out. And people will ask you about them sometimes, like, well, why did you do this? And it's like, it just felt like that was where it needed to go. And so you develop this other skill but I remember those moments like you're describing where you're like, how do they know? How do they know what note to play?
Well, I remember hearing a quote, maybe it was like Dizzy Gillespie, who said that, it doesn't matter what note he goes to, because the worst case scenario is only a half step away from a better choice.
What a chromaticist he is.
Well, so tell us a little bit more about your studio. I mean, you talked about using Logic. What are some of the reasons why you like working in Logic rather than Pro Tools, for example?
Well, okay. Initially, I started out using a program called Creator. Back in the days before there were DAWs, there were MIDI sequencers. And there were a lot of choices out there at that time, and they all had different concepts. I started with this program called Dr. T's Keyboard Controlled Sequencer, which is one of the most arcane and convoluted methods of creating music I've ever seen. For example,
it was almost as cool as Mr. T's,
Well, Dr. T, Emil Tobenfeld, this guy based up in Boston, his concept was that everything should be able to affect everything else and control everything else. So when you looked at a list of what you had played, it wasn't notated in like notes and timing durations or any kind of quantifiable metric. It was all in clock ticks. So this note is 384 clock ticks after this note. And then this note is 192 clock ticks after this note. And it's like it made no sense to any musicians.
Yeah.
And then I started to see these more visually oriented sequences where you could actually record a piece and it became this little Band-Aid that you could move over and put it there or whatever. Things evolved into what we take for granted in a DAW. And I remember on one record where there was somewhat of a budget, I was able to go out and buy an Atari computer and a program called Creator, which was at that time a little bit more sophisticated MIDI sequencer. Well, Creator turned into something called Notator, which allowed musical notation. You could print out scores and do things like that. And then it turned into a program called Logic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then around 2005, Apple bought the entire thing because at that time, the audio engine in Logic was so far superior to what anybody else was doing. And Apple wanted to use it in Final Cut Pro and every other thing that they were using that involved audio.
Was Logic eMagic or something? Am I remembering that right? Yeah.
That's right, eMagic. And so Apple bought eMagic and it became Apple Logic.
Well, so
now,
it's funny because I also remember the time when Logic was still MIDI and Pro Tools had the audio. And then if you really want to get Ninja, you'd figure out how to sync the two apps and have them both open at the same time on your computer.
There was some tricky ways to do that, and it inevitably caused Pro Tools to crash. But or, Logic would just sort of sit there and go, well, we're waiting for you to reboot. Yeah, those were nightmare days. But the reality was that Apple came in and bought this program, and to their credit, the same people that developed it are still working on it today. So they didn't fire anybody, which was great.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I work with those people. I deal with them, and I have a lot of say in some of the things that happen. So I'm really kind of invested, and they come to me for like when I was doing I was having this terrible problem getting my outboard gear to, like I said, getting the latency deterministic. Like when I first started setting up here, it was like back in the early 2000s. And it's like, how am I going to control? I just put this compressor across this vocal, and now it's not lined up with where it was. How do I determine that? I wrote a plugin to allow me to adjust the latency by 1/8 of a sample. And I could really dial it in. And it was a nightmare. And so they sent somebody over. They watched how I was working. They said, we could do something like this. We could just make it a button. I said, yeah, just a single sample impulse goes out, comes back in. Long story short, though, the reason that Apple bought Logic is because back then, Pro Tools was using a fixed point data architecture for their audio, which means like they went from a 16-bit to a 24-bit internal, and then a 48-bit internal fixed point. And Apple or Logic was using a floating point. Mm-hmm. The difference between fixed point and floating point, there are several, but the most important one is it's literally impossible to overload or to clip a floating point signal, because a floating point, like a 32-bit or 64-bit floating point thing, is literally a 24-bit word with an 8-bit multiplier that can move that level up or down over 1,536 dB of dynamic range without any degradation to the sound.
Well, it's like if you have a ceiling or a noise floor, it just adjusts for it, right?
Yeah, it just normalizes it in that range. So what at the time, Pro Tools was using a fixed point engine, which means if you get above digital 0, there was nowhere to go and it would clip. And then you'd have quantization errors at the low end of that. And it was kind of a nightmare.
In other words, you had to really hit the sweet spot with the converter.
You did, and you really had to pay attention, just like you do in the real world, in the analog world. I have one friend who's a producer, songwriter in LA who identified this problem early on. He said, I think I figured out why Pro Tools sounds so bad. He says it's because everybody's clipping their plugins, and they don't pay any attention to it. And there's a bunch of tests that were done at the time. Paul Frindle, who wrote a lot of plugins for Sonox, he worked in the Sony Oxford console. He designed the G Series SSL EQ back in the day. He had a simple demonstration where if you took a 100 hertz sine wave and put a 20 hertz high pass filter on it, the signal would increase by like 3 dB in the output. And it's like, why would that happen? It's not even close to that frequency. You're high pass filtering at 20 hertz and you got a 100 hertz sine wave. There's nothing below 100 hertz. Just due to the way that the filtering works, you have what he'd call an illegal signal level. It was going over 0. But if you didn't know about those things or pay attention to them or put a meter in between every plugin, you'd never know that it would start to clip. So Logic didn't have that problem. Apple said, we're buying this. Meanwhile, back in those days, the internet was just aflame with DAW battles. Logic sounds terrible. Pro Tools sounds great.
Nuendo sounds best.
Oh, yeah. It was endless. And nobody really identified why did Pro Tools sound the way it did? Why would Apple be gravitating towards a rather unknown program compared to what they could have bought up Digi and eaten them up for lunch,
Yeah.
I remember at that time, in the mid-2000s, I mixed a record for Soul Asylum, their last record they did for Sony. And we sent it off to Doug Sachs, the late Doug Sachs, who died shortly after that, for mastering. And he got all the mixes, and he called me up on the phone, and he's like, you didn't mix this on Pro Tools, did you? And I'm like, no, I didn't. I said, why do you ask? He goes, because it doesn't sound like Pro Tools. I said, is that good or bad? He goes, no, it sounds great. They sound phenomenal. He goes, it doesn't sound like Pro Tools. Like, that's interesting. This guy's been mastering records for decades, you know. And he ended the conversation saying, but don't worry, when I'm done, it'll sound like it was done on Pro Tools.
Oh, that's funny, man. I'm not sure where to go with that.
But that was back in the days, right? So then everybody basically adapted to making a floating point thing, and you end up with not having these headroom issues, and people could get by with, you know, not having to pay attention to a lot of the things that, frankly, you don't need to pay attention to unless they're a problem, right? And to get into a more serious topic, the main difference between people who do this for a living and really are invested in it is that you develop a skill of knowing what to listen to and what to listen for and what are you hearing about something and being able to identify it and not be mystified by it, you know. So if somebody like this producer friend of mine back in the early days of Pro Tools was saying, I'm hearing these plugins doing this thing, and every time we use them, it's like this thing happens to the mix where it's no longer, you know, the way I want to hear it. And it takes time to identify that stuff. But that's kind of developing a skill set through repetition. It's like, well, you know, well, this one plugin sounds fine, but now I've got 24 channels of them and something's wrong. What happened?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many funny things about recording. I'm also thinking about, you know, recent project I did where I struggle with, there's something about it that doesn't sound right to me mix-wise, like, oh, I know I should jump in and do all these things to it. I just feel like I'm supposed to. But yet when I listen to it the way it is, I just love it already. And so then I'm like, you know, is that rough mix? Is that demoitis? Or is that, you know, is that just that there's actually a thing that's just great about this as is and I don't need to mess it up, you know? Another good skill, you know, knowing when to back away. Yeah. It's like, it's done. Let it be what it is. I mean, I get that intimately. You know, some of the artists I worked with worked very rapidly. And there's plenty of time for somebody to stick their, you know, hand up and go, well, yeah, but what about, you know, and it's like, does that matter to this song? You know? Well, I've noticed that about working with great musicians, especially great jazz musicians. They will be quick to identify that they need to play it again, and then they'll be quick to tell you, no, that performance is great, that one I just did, you know? Yeah. If you're ready to upgrade your studio to the famous sound of API's large format consoles, then you're ready for the Box, a small format console featuring the same analog circuitry and original 2520 op-amp design that has made API famous for 50 years. Record through 8 world-class mic pre-channels, mix through 24 smooth-as-glass faders, and blend mics, analog effects, and parallel compression at the speed of electrons rather than the speed of your computer latency. Upgrade your home studio to legendary status with The Box from APIaudio.com. Let's talk a little bit about you receiving a mix and how you begin the process and how you also identify some of those ways to, like, you know, what to mess around with and what to leave alone. What does that process look like for you? Like, I've just decided I'm going to work with Chuck Zwicky. I send you this stuff to mix. What does what I send you look like? Right. So just technically, I ask people to send me just the contiguous audio files. Mm-hmm. You know, basically, if this was a multi-track tape, just send me the tape. Mm-hmm. And, you know, have a track sheet that's labeled. I don't often, you know, unless they did something really special that's part of the whole vibe of the thing, well, give me those tracks with your plugins on them. So if I can't beat them here with better tools or more specific once the mix is done, you know, because a lot of times people will come up with a sound, they think that's really the basis of something, and then the song evolves and they end up like, well, this doesn't really fit so much anymore, but we were going for something like this, so I can build. But to step back, so I will get the files in, I'll import them into my session, you know, label them, whatever I need to do, assign them to groups. All the drums are off this subgroup, and, you know, it's just like I would do it on a console. And the first thing I generally do
is just push all the faders up to about -20. So there's this hum of every track playing, and I kind of get an idea of what's there, and I just pull everything down. I'll push up the vocal, and I'll say, okay, what's this song about? What's it supposed to feel like?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll start to build up the mix around that vocal. And you always end up. I always say defer to the vocal. Like when I'm working on a mix, I will put the vocal channel in what's called solo safe. That means no matter what else I solo, that track will never mute.
Ooh, that's clever, man. I like that. That's a first right there.
Right. So, you could work for hours on a kick drum sound and go, this is the most badass kick drum sound you ever heard. But it makes the vocal sound weird, or it makes the vocal sound tiny, And I worked with this brilliant songwriter, arranger, composer named Paul Savoy, a.k.a. Paul Wakhtar. His band is called Aha. And they're from Norway.
Fantastic.
And
Take On Me, right?
Take On Me from their first album. Those guys are amazing, just amazing. And
talk about a song that has lasted through generations. My 14-year-old kid has loved that song for years already.
Oh yeah, yeah. Everybody knows that song. Everybody loves that song. And this is a good time to interject some perspective. They recorded that song 3 times.
Interesting. What's that mean? And what's the story behind that?
Well, they recorded it in Norway. They had a sort of a minor bit of radio attention, and they'd moved to England, and they ended up working with several different producers, and they just kept going over it and over it and over it. Ultimately, they worked with this guy, Tarney, what's his first name? And they came up with the version that you hear and know and love. But just, the amount of effort that goes into that, I was hoping to get on the topic, because it's relevant to everybody in this business, of failure versus success.
Mm-hmm.
They thought the song was good. They redid it. Lots of battles ensuing with the record label, not liking this idea, not liking that idea. Thing became a monstrous hit, but wasn't just something they happened upon.
Yeah. I looked up his name too. It was Alan Tarney.
Alan Tarney. That's right. Yeah. So when I was working with Paul in the Aha, the last studio Aha record, which was around 2015, he had gotten Alan involved to maybe do some work. He gets a lot of people involved to, sort of continue to sculpt these things. And it's a really good process. But at that time, he had finished their record, and the band said, well, it doesn't really sound so much like us. It was he'd done a beautiful job, but it had like live strings, guitar, bass, drums. It was kind of big and sort of Beatlesy sounding. And they're like, well, that's not really us. So he said, he invited me and a bunch of our mutual friends over to his place, and he said, I just bought this modular synth. This enormous modular synth that he bought. And I'm like, well, that's really amazing. So I set him up with a couple of patches. And then he called me and said, hey, do you want to help me finish this record? I'm like, certainly. So he said, here's what I want to do. He goes, the band's not particularly happy with the direction of this record as I finished it. So I want to replace every instrument on tape with a bespoke modular synth sound. So like, okay, that's fun. I can do that. So he sort of gave me carte blanche, like, here, let's just come up with a bass drum sound here. And I literally on this modular synth using like 7 oscillators and 3 envelope generators and 2 noise generators and 4 filters. I'd come up with something, and he'd come in and he'd solo up the lead vocal, and he goes, just tweak it until the vocal sounds good.
Oh, that's great, man.
Isn't that amazing?
And now wait, this was like, you dialing in the modular synth on the Aha track, or this was okay, great. And was it on? It was on that song. Sorry, it was on Take On Me, or a different song? More recently.
I was a child when that record came out. No, this was in 2015.
Okay, right. That's what I thought. Sorry, we're moving fast here.
Sure. I think the record that we worked on came out around 2016-ish, 2017. But
as referenced earlier, I have fog brain going on right now.
Fine. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so basically that insight was tremendous to me, because every single sound, like every sound I created on that record was just a unique sound that literally took hours to create. And I'd say to him, well, but this is an amazing bass drum recipe. I can create any kind of bass drum sound with this thing I've set up. Do you want to go to some other songs? He says, no, I want you to start over for every song.
Wow.
Which is fantastic. And also I think that your listeners, should be aware that you only get good by practice and repetition and by starting over from scratch and having to build it up with no preconceptions. And it's a modular synth. I couldn't just go, let me just recall that last one so that I could use that as a starting place. It's kind of like, no, I pulled all the patches and I'm patching things in a different way now, and I'll stumble upon something that I never would have expected to. But every sound was done that way. And I like to ask people who've worked with artists or producers that I respect a lot, like, one question: what did you gain from working with them? What insight did you gain? Because everybody has some bit of experience that they have that you are completely unaware of the importance of it. And you walk away from working with these people for maybe months, weeks, or even years. And you're like, now I know what that is about, or why they made that decision.
Yeah. Yep.
So my experience working with Paul, one of the most prolific and talented and calm and serene artists I've ever worked with, was just this notion that work on that sound until the vocal sounds amazing. So when I'm working on a mix, it's the same thing. I've got the vocal solo safe, so it's always there. And if I'm EQing a drum sound or a guitar or something, it's like, it can be the most badass guitar sound in the world on its own, but if it makes the vocal sound a little tiny when it comes in, sometimes you're like, well, don't try to give so much attention to that. Of course, a lot of these problems are solved later by automation, by mixing. Mm-hmm. But when setting it up, it's kind of like there's a focus in this. And I like to say that if you're working on a song, it's a portrait. If you're working on instrumental music, it's more of a landscape. So like as a landscape painter, you're going to deal with a lot of issues of perspective and where are you and how did that space get to be where it is. But if it's a portrait, it's about the subject of that portrait. And for example, as a painting analogy, if you're worried about the bunch of grapes sitting on the table in front of the person in the portrait, that's kind of irrelevant if the person in the portrait isn't represented.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to say, but the grapes were great.
Well, it's funny because when you talk about it in this mixing context with the solo safe, funny enough, it is an aha moment. It's like, an aha moment for your aha moment where you're like, oh, that's such a great trick. But then you think about if you play acoustic guitar, you play any kind of acoustic instrument and you play with somebody who's singing, and you start playing together and then somebody's just playing too loud and you can't hear what the singer's doing. It's just so immediately obvious in that context. And it's really eye-opening or ear-opening how easily we forget that in the studio multi-track context of things. Or, for example, if I was playing an electric guitar and the singer's not really singing yet or singing, meaningfully during a tracking session, I might be so inclined to put too much in there. And then when I get a chance to start really paying attention to the singing or just listen or come back, record it and then go listen to what I just did, all of a sudden it's so obvious. It's like, I can't play that part. I thought that was the greatest little 3-note part in the world on my guitar arpeggio, but it completely steps all over what the vocal's doing in that moment. So just delete it. Just get rid of it, Yeah. Just play under. Less is more.
My favorite thing, the most powerful thing I use when mixing is the mute button.
Yes.
It's very important.
That's what I list as the first tool in mixing is the mute button. And then the second tool is the fader.
Yeah.
And third, I guess, is probably maybe, the pan.
Well, the mute button is the most draconian fader possible. But the fader is really the only tool you have. The only thing you have available to you in mixing is, as my friend Terry Manning says, the only tool you have available is volume. Yep. And you can break that down into what is an EQ. It's volume and different frequency, parts of the frequency range, that's all you really have. A lot of people, for example, who solo an instrument and EQ it and get it to sound a certain way, then can't fit it in the track because the volume balance of that sound in the context of the rest of the song can't be made to make sense.
Yeah.
But a lot of musical genres have started from these kinds of sounds that are completely exciting all by themselves, sort of being forced to fit into something else, which leads to a kind of more minimalist approach because they don't want to lose the bigness of one sound. So get rid of whatever else is competing with it. And you end up with, a different style of music, a different way of approaching music, which is valid. There's no right answer.
Yeah. So cool. Well, hey, let's take a break for just a moment. Rock stars, we're going to come back for the jam session. And we're going to dig more into working with some of the artists that Chuck has worked with, like Prince and 9 Inch Nails and others. And we'll see you guys in just a minute for the jam session. You know what it feels like when inspiration hits and you want to capture your great song idea, but then the studio gets in the way and it's just no fun anymore. Wouldn't it feel awesome if you could simplify the process of producing your music from inspiration to final masterpiece? PreSonus Studio One is a powerful digital audio workstation that helps you compose your music with a complete collection of virtual instruments for keyboards and drums, MIDI tools for hip-hop, EDM, and film, a flexible sketch pad with chord charts and key recognition for songwriting and arranging, and classic effects pedals and amp simulators for guitar and bass. With 37 high-quality effects plugins, integrated Melodyne, and drag and drop flexibility, you can easily edit and polish your mixes. And Studio One is the only DAW with a built-in mastering studio so that you can take your record from writing to radio ready all in one place. Download your free version of Studio One Prime and get started now at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. If you're using a Mac in your recording studio and you're tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly, then Otherworld Computing is the solution for you. OWC can help keep your existing Mac and studio current and relevant so that you can make great music. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac, you can get the most mileage out of your studio with OWC. Offering a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49, there's no need to get frustrated when you can achieve the speed to create and the capacity to dream at OWC.com. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today joining us is Chuck Zwicky from Manhattan. And Chuck, you ready to jam, dude?
Mm-hmm.
All right, man. All right. So we were just going to talk a little bit about some of the cool stuff you've got in your rack there. Do you want to tell us what when you look around at your rack there, what kind of stuff do you see around where you're mixing?
Well, I use a lot of outboard compression in ways that I've, like, for example, I've used all of the gear that's in my rack for most of my career in various studios. And I've always sort of liked the idea that once you get to know a piece of gear, you kind of have a thing, an interaction with it that you can bring something out of it that only it can do. So I tend to avoid pieces of gear that are marketed as Swiss Army knives, for example, because I kind of know what I want to hear out of it. So I've got most of the gear in my rack is customized by me in some way or another as well. So there's a lot of unusual stuff, but lots of limiters. I have a beautiful old tube copy of an LA2 that Peavey made way back in the 90s. Called the VCL2. I was never happy with the sound of it, so I redesigned the output amplifier stage of it, and there was an unused tube section in that circuit that was just sitting there. I'm like, well, I can use this to do something else in this circuit. So there's a lot of, I kind of hate that I am reliant on such customized gear in some ways. So over the years, I've sort of sold off a lot of those pieces and sort of gotten back to vanilla stuff. Like I have an SSL bus compressor, and it's like, that's about as, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to modify it. There's no way to improve it. It is exactly what it is and does exactly what it does. So, a lot of the things about using any tools is learning how they work for you and understanding them. There seems to be a lot of interest in people sort of altering or changing or, getting 10 different variations of the same thing, especially in the plugin world. But, sticking with some very basic things will teach you a lot more about yourself and the music than about, the nuances of this piece of gear versus that piece of gear. And,
well, that's true. But I do believe that the collector in all of us gets pretty excited about some cool, unique things.
Sure.
Well, so what are some unusual things that you might have in your rack? I think you mentioned that you had an old Ensoniq.
I do have
processor, right?
I do have a bunch of that stuff around. I have an Ensoniq DP Pro, which is something that I worked with them when they were developing, and it kind of was the end of their time. But that's interesting. I mean, for example, I have a pair of Lexicon PCM 70s, which I've always liked the sound of that as a reverb, but I've always hated fiddling with them because it's this little fluorescent display and 10 pages of menus. So what I've done recently is I've designed a control interface that is a plugin in my DAW that gives me like a giant lark, like a remote on the screen. And each of the parameters, like in the concert hall algorithm, there's 29 parameters, and each of those is on a control, not only on this screen where I can see them all, but also appears on my control surface. I have this Mackie C4, which has 32 knobs on it. And above each of them is a display. So I have now all the parameters of this Lexicon PCM 70 reverb algorithm on a control surface. So I have a knob for every size, low frequency decay, high frequency. Yeah, and it makes programming instantaneous.
How do you even do something like that? Does it use MIDI to control things like that?
It's over MIDI, yeah. So I just bought a second PCM 70 and I updated the firmware on that to version 3. And that gives you full control over the SysX data over MIDI. And then I use this program called CTRLR controller. And it basically, it's geeky. I had to spend a lot of time looking up all the SysX tables and determining which bytes, most significant, least significant are being altered by this parameter, and then, making this thing work. And, so far I've written 4 of these for 4 different algorithms in the thing, but what it's giving me is the ability to have absolute control over a beautiful piece of hardware from the 80s and recallability in each of my sessions. So every time I recall, it sends this data out. It's there. It's saved with the thing. I can automate it in the mix if I want to.
Wow.
That's a lot of fun. The geekiness continues where I just bought, kind of on a lark. When I was a kid, every studio, I'm from Minneapolis, I don't know if you know this, but when I was a kid, every little studio in Minneapolis had this digital delay called an Effectron. And it was a blue 1-rack space thing with these little push buttons like a radio on a car radio for the delay settings. And it used a very different kind of thing. It wasn't a PCM delay, it was a Delta mod made by a company called Delta Labs. And I thought, well, that's a curious thing. That was a kind of an early, what is digital audio really going to be like? Now it's all PCM, but back then there was different ways of encoding data, and DBX had their method and Lexicon had their method, and everybody had their way of dealing with digital signal processing. So I bought one of these and I listened to it and I'm like, oh, that's a really unusual sounding delay. And I discovered in the back there was this jack that said control. So I looked at the schematic, and sure enough, it's a 5-volt control voltage input that controls the delay multiplier knob from 0.25 to 1 times. So you have the full range of the delay on this control voltage. So my audio interfaces have the ability to send out DC. So I wrote a plugin that allows me to send out a DC voltage, and that allows me to control the delay time from my DAW. So I have this digital delay as an outboard piece where I can not only just control the delay time, but I can modulate it, I can modify it, I can control all the aspects of this delay. I can make the delay time change within a song if I want, or just set it up. So I wrote this plugin that sends out a DC voltage, also has in it a bunch of really complicated little things that allow you to introduce random types of modulation. So I can literally make this digital delay sound like a tape echo.
Wow, that's such a trip, man. And, I think one thing that's fascinating for us too is it's just cool as hell to hear stories about, mad scientist stuff in the studio. And B, even for those of us who are like, oh man, that's insane. Like, just give me a good plug-in. It's just a great reminder of everything that goes into the things that we take for granted today. Like the idea that you can just put a plug-in on, and of course you just set it, pull up a preset, or it follows the tempo of your session. Those things all evolved from, incredible amounts of hard work that people put into designing gear that evolved towards that.
Yes, and they took a lot of time to make sure that all aspects of it were usable and accessible. So this piece of gear is not complicated to look at or to use, but it can be resurrected for the modern DAW environment by just doing a little bit of control like that. And that was really exciting to me. So I bought 2 of them. And the first time I was using them in a mix, I have like an intern / assistant who comes by like maybe once a week and basically asks me a lot of questions about why are you doing this, why are you doing that. And when I was just getting these things rolling, I had been using just a regular plug-in delay in Logic, which is very flexible and can emulate basically anything you need it to. And I just sort of went to these hardware delays, and even her reaction was like, wait a minute, what is that? And I said, well, that's just the hardware delay. So just that little delay, that's the only thing you changed? She goes, yeah. She goes, well, the whole mix just turned into this whole other, like this just opened up into this thing. And I'm like, yeah, it's the thing I like about outboard gear is it's not deterministic. It's like, it's a physical device which has, the constraints of all the laws of physics. And it responds in a way to a signal that is, not necessarily predictable. And when someone codes a plugin, they can only reproduce the things which they have identified. So there's a level of something like this. These Delta Lab delay lines from the 80s have a very peculiar thing in them. The way they deal with the frequency response in and coming out of them, it gives them a different texture. I mean, just 2 of those delays sounds more like my old Lexicon 224 did than any other delay I've ever heard in my life. Like there's a kind of a papery texture to the sound that goes through them. So what I like about each of my pieces of outboard gear is that they all bring something that I didn't ask for, but contribute something in a way that's like not necessarily subtle. And by the end of the day, when you've got all these channels going, it's developed this whole, synergistic thing that's just more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, there's probably more randomness going on too. I remember, I think it was Craig Alvin, when he was on the podcast the first time, we talked about some of the benefits of using an analog reverb. Or, even if it's a digital reverb, it still goes to analog before it gets reconverted into your session. And that our theory was that it introduces an element of random sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? What's the noise you add to, what's the noise we add to our digital signal to make it
dithering?
Dithering.
You're talking about dithering. Well, let me just disabuse you of that notion. It's a lot less random than you think.
Okay, all right.
I mean, there's literally nothing we've encountered in recording technology that's more accurate than, say, the D-to-A to D converters that we have. That's a step beyond tape recorders or consoles that we've ever experienced. To that end, I used to do a lot of projects for producers down in Nashville, and they tend to be really gear-oriented people in Nashville. And I remember being asked a lot by these producers, well, wait a minute, you're taking my tracks and you're sending them out through converters into outboard gear and then back into the computer? Because in Nashville, we say, once you're digital, stay digital. And I always had this theory that plugins cause more, unwanted artifacts to the sound than any converter ever does. And I subsequently proved this through a series of experiments. For example, when you send a sine wave into a compressor and you look at the spectrum that comes out of it, let's just take, for example, the SSL bus compressor that I use. If I feed 100 hertz sine wave into that and I look at the spectrum out of it, because of the gain reduction mechanism, the attack and release time constants mostly, you're going to see 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 hertz harmonics being generated. They're not distortion, they're amplitude modulation. They're just the way that the gain reduction mechanism is interacting with that tone produces a series of harmonics. Because of that, it fills up the spectrum in the low mids. Like you feed a bass guitar into it, all those harmonics fill up and give this warmth to the bass.
Mm-hmm.
A digital compressor in every SSL plug-in for a bus compressor only produce odd order harmonics. So you put 100 hertz tone, you only see 300, 500, 700, 900 hertz. You're not going to see, And this is a problem. This is something that I work with about 10 different plug-in companies, helping them understand these things, develop these things, test these things. And none of them have been able to get to the point where their plugins behave the way that the hardware does in that respect. So it adds this quality to the sound that you might not notice so much. I mean, if just going through one of these devices, you may not notice, well, there's kind of an absence of the even harmonics. Now, I don't know if you know much about waveforms, but a square wave is a composite of all the odd ordered harmonics. And a square wave sounds very reedy and hollow and sort of like a flute in a sense. Mm-hmm. A sawtooth wave is very brassy and bright, and it's a composite of all the even ordered harmonics. So when you run a signal through something that's only going to produce odd ordered harmonics, it's going to become more like a square wave, hollower, further away, less immediate. But even harmonics is going to be more immediate. So because of all this stuff existing in the hardware, and because I have tested it, and I thought that just plugging that compressor in on my mix improves that sound in this really interesting and subtle way. So I tested it. And on my website, back to the original point, which was, aren't you damaging the sound by going out through these converters and coming back into your DAW? I decided to test it. So I took 2 signal sources, a recording of an acoustic piano, and just the overhead tracks from a drum recording. And I ran them out to my converters and back in 60 times. So going out the conversion and back in 60 times. And I sent the resulting, it's on my website.
Just for clarity's sake, this was before forced lockdown?
This, like I said, self-isolation is my default mode. So, so basically,
60 times.
60 times, and I sent I wrote it up on a page on my website, and I sent it to every producer I was working with and every mastering engineer I was working with, and all of the producers wrote back and said, "This is unbelievable. This is not what I expected to hear." 60 generations, and nobody got cancer, nobody died. It didn't sound like what people think digital should sound like after 60 generations of conversion.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to note that none of the mastering engineers responded at all. They didn't want to be caught.
They were already doing it.
Well, they didn't want to be caught out with an opinion, one way or the other, because their livelihood depends on telling people that, only their converters will not harm their music.
If you want to capture every nuance of a great performance in your studio, then you're going to need to start with a microphone that is crafted with great care and attention to detail. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia designs amazing sounding microphones that are handcrafted with jeweler's precision to bring you incredible detail in your recordings. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique golden drop capsule design, which uses a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity while avoiding distracting colorations and distortions. This is my voice right now on the new Amethyst microphone with Class A discrete amplifier circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and advanced built-in shock mount technology to bring an expensive sound to your studio for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the Amethyst microphone at jzmic.com. During the height of record making, Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, Ardent Studios, and the New York City record plant all turned to one company to build their consoles. That company is now Spectra 1964, carried on today through Bill Cheney and Jim Romney. The extremely stable, high-speed circuit design of the 101 amplifier provides unequaled headroom, low noise, and linear output irrespective of transient audio peaks, giving you cleaner, punchier, dynamic recordings. Spectra 1964 brings you the sound of ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, King Crimson, John Lennon, and so many more. Created by the missile engineers who were central in rolling out the systems that protected the free world for over half a century, Spectra 1964 literally brings rocket science to your studio. With the STX 600 mic pre with built-in complimenter, full-frequency passive BBDI, and C610 dedicated complimenter, start making records that last a lifetime at Spectra1964.com. Well, that's fascinating. Shoot, I had a question for you, but now I just forgot what it was. But that's pretty amazing, and it's really intriguing to remind me to just simply go back and try a SSL style compressor as a plugin on a mix, and then just run it out through I have a custom built SSL style. And they won't be the same thing, won't be apples and apples, but still, I just need to remember to do that more often and see how each sounds.
And likewise, every few months, because like I said, I work with about 10 different plugin companies, so I have plugins from all of them, the complete set. Every 6 months or so, I'll get a mix and I'll think, let me just use these plugins. And if they're an emulation of something I have in my hardware, I had a 1967 Blue Stripe 1176. So a company comes up with something they're calling that, and I'll sit and I'll make a setting that matches what I have in my hardware as close as possible, just in case something breaks and I need to just substitute something. So every few months I'll start a mix and I'll just build it up using the plugins, and I'll get to the point where I'm starting to think yeah, this is pretty good. Okay, this is feeling pretty good. And then I'll just one by one pop in the actual hardware, and I'll just start laughing. Wait a minute. How did I ever think that was getting me to this place where I am now, where the mix just feels something from it, and it's tangible, and the vocal is floating in space in front of you, and all these things that just you don't hear until you've accumulated a lot of
listening experience.
Not so much that, but just accumulated a lot of the repetition of the same things happening on all your tracks. It becomes, one plugin might sound fine to people. Listen, it sounds good. Got A/B, this one plugin versus thing. Well, now you've got 20 channels with that plugin on it. What does that sound like?
Right. Well, it's a tricky thing because, of course, not all of us have racks of outboard gear. And then even if you do have racks of outboard gear, then the question is, okay, well, what sort of system do you want to set up? Do you want to get 70 inputs like Chuck and have things patched in all the time, or what works?
No, it's not recommended. I mean, I could help anybody have a setup like I do, where I literally have had people 10 years later, 15 years later saying, do you still have this mix? Could you do a version with, and I'm like, I can do it. It's all calibratable. It's all repeatable. There's no mystery to it for me. So this is kind of going back to the whole discussion you were talking about, where why does something sound better going out into a piece of hardware and it's this random thing? Well, I don't really believe in random. I think that there's a certain aspect to it that you can quantify, but you have to know what you're listening for and what is it bringing to it. And, I remember working with I'll keep his name out if you like, a very, very famous producer who was working with this artist who was getting a little fed up, getting a little contentious. And at one point, the artist came up to me in front of him, pointed at the console and the racks of gear in the studio we're working at. And he says, you know how this stuff works? And I said, yeah. He goes, you know what all these knobs do, right? And then I said, yeah. And he points at the producer and says, so why do we need him? And
wow.
I said,
you're like a lunch order. Lunch.
No, I know. I turned to the artist and I said, well, yes, I know exactly how each of these things work, but he knows how much. Nice. Right? That's his job. His job is not to be the technical guy. His job is to say, it's getting a little in this area. Can we do something about that? And I'm like, yeah, I can do that. Definitely. It's my job is to translate what he's hearing into those buttons and knobs, right? Yeah. But that's the point. Like, yeah, I know how all this stuff works, but it doesn't mean anything. He knows why. He knows how much. And that's the way that particular producer was so great because I learned so much about how he hears things. He would get frustrated when we're cutting a vocal at the mix on the board. And he'd just pull everything down. He'd put his hands on the faders and he'd push it up. And within 3 seconds, it was this amazing thing that just happened. And you're like, how did you do that?
That's a trip, man.
Same everything. Just pushes it right up and like, that's the feel. So there's a lot to be said about that kind of experience. I mean, a little tangent, but there was a discussion on Facebook where someone was sort of talking about how people get really they sort of become imprinted on their rough mixes, right? Or what some people call demoitis. Maybe they're just talking about
I used that word already.
Yeah. Inflammation of the demoitis. But really, it's an interesting thing. There's a couple things. Like, my assistant asks me these questions like that just crack me up. She's like in her early 20s, and she's like, "So, when did you realize you just knew everything?" And I'm like, "No, she's not winding me up. She's like really thinks there's a point you reach in your life where you just get it and it's all settled." And I'm like, no. I have no idea. Everything I'm doing is an experiment and mostly a failed experiment. Like, I'm always getting into some area where like that didn't work and backing out and trying something else. But this thing that happens with people is this idea of certainty and this idea that you're going to know these things and there's going to be an absolute way to do it. And you're going to be the person that people will come to because you've got this certain quality or thing that you've amassed and you can just reproduce it. Well, that's almost never the case with successful people, that they reach some place where they've arrived and that's it. It's always continual learning and continuous education, Yeah. So this idea that this person asked was, I did a mix and they sent me their rough mix and it was, fucking terrible. And blah, blah, blah. The basic narrative arc, as you get to know these human behaviors, was I did something and the client didn't like it and they referenced their demo, so I'm going to demonize them publicly. And I was trying to assure this person in this conversation that there was something that is your job and there's something that they have given you as a big clue. And it's that you might not like the sound of their rough mix. And you may decide that you can make it better. And you may stick your neck out and do something with it. And then they will hear it and they will hate it. And rather than going online and saying my client is an idiot and they're totally have demoitis and why don't they understand how great I am? Because I'm using all the plugins that the companies told me I needed to be great. Well, the thing is that person, much like this goes back to that story of working with that producer who could just push the faders up. When you're working on a project, if you've produced records or written and produced and then recorded, you're constantly working on this thing and the singer goes out and suddenly you're just like, let's tweak that. Let's turn that percussion down a little bit. Let's bring this up. You're always tweaking this mix, right? Mm-hmm. As you're laying down parts. And I mean, when I'm working on a project as a producer who's playing on the record, it's like nothing frustrates me more than technology when I've got an instrument in my hands,
Yeah, no doubt. Me too.
Yeah.
Like if I have to be both engineer and musician and creative and songwriter, it's just I get pissed off really quickly.
Yeah, but I mean, I've spent my whole life being that guy in the studio, playing an instrument, playing the thing. So when I work with a musician, I appreciate their frustration and where they're coming from. So back to the story about the person complaining about the client didn't like what they were doing with the thing. I was trying to point out to them, this person has been in this room with this song and they've been just unconsciously tweaking this, that, the other thing. It might sound really weird to you, what they've sent you, but there's no doubt that it has a musicality and a feel that they identify with.
Mm-hmm.
And sound is fragile and feel is durable. If you get the feel right, it will carry through the worst playback systems, right? But if all you have is the sound, that's very fragile. If it only works on this system, if it only sounds good in your studio, if it only sounds good if recorded at 96K at 24 bits, you have other problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? Feel is durable. If you get the feel right, and if you listen to their rough mix, you might not appreciate the sounds, and they might not like the sounds either, but the feel is what they're hearing. And when I do a mix for somebody, they never comment on the sounds. It's always something is bugging them, and it's like, because I use this part of this instrument over this part in that part of the song because of that. And the feel they're going for is so different. And you listen to their rough neck, yeah. They're pushing it in this way. That feel of that guitar that's just pulling slightly this way is making that vocal do this thing. And I'm just like, I've missed it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing you need to pay attention to. And like when this producer would just pull down all the faders and push them up in a few seconds, you're like, oh my God, that's obvious. That's so obvious that he just did. Now it's plainly obvious what that song is supposed to feel like.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how, different parts, and you talked about volume and frequency, a particular guitar part that sounds kind of woolly and full in the low mids. But when you, by itself, you might be like, oh, I should EQ that and make it more spanky and bright or something. And you mess around with it, and then you realize when you go back and listen, you're like, no, none of that. Woolliness was the only thing that tied the bridge together just right,
Yeah.
And I just killed it. It would be hard to describe in one sentence what gives records a legendary sound, but it would be easy to describe in 3 letters: API. For more than 50 years, API Audio has created large format consoles for world-class studios. Famous for co-founder Saul Walker's circuit designs and the original 2520 op-amp, the sound of API consoles is the sound of great music. API now brings that legendary sound to your home studio with the Box, a small format console featuring the famous API circuitry that is the perfect analog addition for your digital studio. The Box gives you 8 recording channels on the left with built-in mic pre's, high-pass filters, direct inputs, and custom loadable 500 module slots, and 16 summing channels on the right, or mix using all 24 channels, including aux sends, inserts, and silky smooth faders, feeding a master section with classic API compression, switchable monitor sends, and a Pro TalkBack switch, and you've just upgraded your studio to legend status with the Box from APIaudio.com. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to start mastering your own records? Rockstars of Mastering walks you through exactly how I mastered my own record using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. Want to learn how to create a mix that doesn't suck but rocks instead? At Mixmaster Bundle, I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins so that you can have punchy, powerful drums, guitars that rock, bass you can feel, and a mix that is in your face. Plus, it's totally free as my way of saying thanks for listening. Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes below. To talk about, if I jump to a couple of artists you worked with, it makes me think about feel and sounds. Prince and 9 Inch Nails. I think both of those artists appreciate and understand the feel and certainly appreciate and understand the sound. What stories can you share about things you learned from working with either of them?
Okay. So I worked with Prince for years at Paisley Park and did what's mostly in the vault, the equivalent of about 10 albums worth of material. Just
wow,
incredibly prolific artist. And people have asked me subsequently, like, what did Prince like on his vocal? And and it's like being there with him and recognizing in him, like basically when they threw me in with Prince for the first time, management and other people were filling my head with all their kind of sycophantic fantasies and fears. Don't talk to him about this. Don't do this. He doesn't like this. He doesn't like that. And within a few hours of being in the room alone with him, I realized these guys don't know him at all. He's just an incredibly hardworking, dedicated musician. And your job is to stay out of the way of that guy's brain.
Yeah.
So someone would ask me years later, like, oh, what mics did he like? And what compressor did he ever ask you for? I'm like, if he ever mentioned gear to you, you were fucked. Because it meant he noticed something wasn't happening, or something had changed. And it was like the whole notion of how he worked was something that I felt it was my job to preserve the ability for him to just go and do the things he needed to do without, and it took me a while to get that, to like I said, like people had filled my head with all this, oh, don't say this, he doesn't know this, and he knows a lot. And he knows mostly what it is he's going for. And if you urged something to be a certain way, oh, he could rip you apart in seconds. I mean, he used to threaten with like, if I recorded something and or he would just put in some parts and I'd pointed out maybe that they were too hot on the tape or too low level on the tape, he would rip you apart. And he would say like, you need to go down to Nashville if you want to make records like that.
Wow. So is it so when did you feel like you could rely on your own, engineering intuition to keep it in the right zone versus getting in the wrong zone? If you're also afraid to say something where you're like, or you're assuming that if it's getting recorded to tape and it's super hot or it's super quiet, he already knows that it's right or wrong. How do you balance that?
Well, for starters, with an artist like that, when I was working with him, I was very young. I was in my very early 20s. And
right.
I probably thought I knew a lot more than I did.
Right.
But I probably knew a lot more than I thought I did at the same time. And a lot of the things that I didn't know about were just aspects of kind of like, well, what I did, I think, do well at that time was to recognize that it might be a problem if everything's on tape too low, but it probably isn't going to be a problem. And what the chief engineer at Paisley at the time, Sal Greco, used to be the chief engineer at Electric Lady Studios here in New York. He used to tell me, if there wasn't something fucked up, it wouldn't be a Prince record.
That's great.
There was always something. And it's like Prince would do something just because he wanted to get something on there, an idea. And he'd mostly cut his vocals when you weren't, didn't want you in the room. He was working by himself, and you'd come in and you're like, where's that vocal coming from? Wait a minute. Oh my God, he cut a vocal while playing the acoustic guitar on this track at the same time. Okay, so we'll deal with that. But it's not like you're going to tell him how to change the way that he wants to work.
What about working with, him when you are pressing the buttons to record him, or maybe you're pressing the buttons to record him playing with other musicians? What were some of the takeaways that you learned right away about, that's a great way to stay out of the way? I mean, were there some specific ways that you learned and techniques?
No, not that I learned, no, but that he taught me, yes. Man, when we were working on a guitar part, he would want me to punch him in to fix like a note at the end of a solo or something, right? Or a bass part. So he's got the instruments in two hands, so he can't do the punch. Otherwise, he would just do the punch himself. Like he was playing a keyboard part, he'd sit there with the locator in one hand and do the punches himself. But he'd want you to punch, and he'd say, punch when you see me nod. And you're like listening to this part he's going for. I'm like, it's the end of 16. It's right there. I know exactly where that punch is. And I'd do the punch, and he'd stop the tape and he'd say, you didn't watch me. I'm like, but that's the note that he wanted punched. I'm sure of it. He's like, but you didn't watch me. He didn't want you to have any control over it at all.
Oh man, that's tough. It's hard to do.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like I said, he taught me. I didn't learn it, but he was always like, don't do that. Like, at one point, though, we were sitting working on a record, kind of a rock trio thing, and he was playing his guitar solo, and I'm getting ready to punch out, and I'm watching his hands as he's playing, and he notices this, and he said, "Do you play guitar?" I'm like, "Yes." And he throws his guitar at me and he says, "It's in B." And so we're rolling, and he wants me to play this solo, and he's like, "It's in B, you play the solo." And he's playing the wah pedal, and I'm playing solo, and I'm like, the first thing I said, "It's in B flat," and he started laughing. And he's like, "Funk it up, Chuck, funk it up." He's like screaming this at me, and so he stops the tape and he goes, "Did you used to be in a band or something?" I'm like, "Well, I just spent all my life basically recording in studios and doing all this." And it was just a bizarre moment, though, but it did kind of change the dynamic, because then he realized that I did kind of get it.
So those are amazing stories about working with Prince. Another artist that I know you worked with was 9 Inch Nails. Can you share any stories about that experience as well?
That was a very different kind of experience, because all I was doing was remastering their 12-inch singles from their first series of 12-inch singles.
Okay, all right.
And Trent Reznor was very, very specific about these being period correct and period specific, and don't try to change them. So for some reason, I don't know why they didn't just use the ones they had. They might have lost them. But the original 12 inches were all mastered by this amazing mastering engineer named Tom Baker, who is also Doctor Who. No, I'm kidding. But
that's my era of Doctor Who right there.
Oh, me too. I used to come home from school every day and turn on Doctor Who. And
me too. Tom Baker. And then I'd have dinner, and then I'd do my homework, and then I'd come back and watch The Fall Guy.
Yeah. So when I used to, get flown to Philadelphia, Malvern, Pennsylvania, actually to work with Ensoniq back then, they always had like, here's a pen, here's whatever. I said, you need to give out screwdrivers. And I'm like, screwdrivers? Why? I said, because you'd have Ensoniq screwdrivers.
Nice.
Totally gonna be, nobody.
Awesome, man.
You have to cut this out because your
no,
listeners don't.
No, that's my favorite, best joke I've heard.
So Tom Baker would go in his TARDIS and do these mastering jobs for all these big rock stars, and I had to sit and listen to what the label had sent me were the transfers off of the vinyl, and match the original mixes to that style. And it was so fascinating to be able to hear what was going on with the masters. And it's just another experiment in critical listening and what can you identify what you're hearing. And I could hear the high frequency limiting that was being used on these, and it was at that time those early singles were very specific in their texture, to put it mildly. Like it was one of those eras where I think they thought that cranking the input to an SPX 90 and running the vocal through it was pretty neat sounding. And so it was all that stuff from those first 12 inches, and just trying to maintain it. It was a very bizarre period, just in terms of like listening to this music, which was very heavy and kind of depressing, and trying to match it technically for what they had already done. And I never really understood why they weren't able to re-release the ones. Maybe they lost the masters of those, but they had the original mixes. So that was a thing. And I never interacted with Trent Reznor on that, except via the label that was releasing it, saying, here's what he likes with this. He's very specific. He wants you to do this, and he doesn't want to do that. And he make sure you don't try to, quote, improve it, change it, make it modern. Just don't do that. And I love that advice. I wish more of the remastered stuff would just leave it alone. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. It's so interesting to hear such a different experience of working with two different artists over your career like that. Do you feel like the time you spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Here are just some of the things students are saying about the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass.
Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process I have ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, condensed into a 6 to 7 hour lesson.
David P.
Thanks for a great session, dude. Just when I needed the inspiration.
John F.
A true feat of greatness. It was really life-changing and worth way more than I paid.
Mark R.
I've literally watched it 2 times at length, taken a plethora of notes, then combed back over some sections even more. You guys really knocked it out of the park on this one, and it was so incredibly eye-opening and useful immediately. What else can I say?
Shane J.
Amazing masterclass with Craig Alvin. My biggest takeaway was the concept of adding a subtle combination of distortion and compression to achieve a buttery cohesion in the sound. But there is so much more.
Steve K. Listen, I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I know you're trying to make your best record ever. But when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then you're ready for UltimateMixingMasterclass.com. Well, we're winding up near the end of the podcast here. Anything else that we didn't talk about that you'd love to make sure we get a chance to discuss?
Well, I guess what I really wanted to talk about in this podcast, and I'm sorry we didn't get into it unless we have another couple of hours, was you had asked me to send a subject, and I said, well, the convenience con. And I thought, the main thing that I see happening with people starting out in this business is they're being marketed to in a way that makes them think that buying these tools will alleviate the work.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said it a few times in this interview that, repetition and practice is how you get good at something. So being able to do something, I have a couple of pet peeves about people in my industry that have some pretty bad attitudes about their work. One is when they complain about their clients, like the demoitis thing or whatever. Or you can always tell, a beginner at this, when they start complaining about the quality of the tracks they receive to mix, it's like the best records you've ever heard probably have some of the worst recordings in them. Some of them are great, but some of them that's your job. Make it exciting for people. So the idea that there's a whole crop of people, possibly a lot of them in your audience that have been hypnotized into believing that expedience is key. They'll go online and say, man, I just slammed out 10 mixes. And it's like, good, you saved yourself some time.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the artist? They've spent months on this. They've spent months really getting this thing to be exactly where they want it. And if expedience is the only thing you care about, that you're not going to have much of a career. Because it's got to be as important to you to convey what they're doing and to be not afraid to do the work, to put in the hours, to really try to identify what it is they're doing. Like, for example, when I work with artists, I do not bill them hourly. I bill them for the project. We agree we have this much money, we can do this. And if it takes 100 passes to get it right, it takes 100 passes to get it right. That's 99 opportunities for me to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, when I was talking about having these ancient digital delays and these other things, there's no button I can push that will set the delay to a metric interval. I have to do it by ear.
Mm-hmm.
And what I discover along the way is, hey, that feels really good when it's just right here. But when I do it when it's exactly in time, in that way, it loses something. So you develop a way of listening, you develop a way of interacting with your tools, and it just requires a lot more work. And I'm never someone who shies away from putting a lot of work into something, because I know it's just going to get better and my listening skills are going to be honed by that process.
I'm glad you brought that up about the delay. It's one of the things that that Bob Solomon, who owned Woodland Studios when I was interning there, that was one of my takeaways from him. He showed me parallel compression back in 94 4, whatever, and I blew my mind when I heard it on the console. And then he talked about delay settings. And, for those of us using an outboard delay back then, Rockstars, you had to like you had to figure out kind of what the tempo was. Then you pull out this crazy looking chart and it divides up the milliseconds for you with, and you think about it like that if you want to, or you learn how to do math. And then he just pointed out, he said, you know what? It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just like, if it's close, it's, I don't know if he said if it's good enough or if he was sort of saying what you're saying, which is close can sound better than trying to get it perfect. And I've noticed that there's a lot of times where, doing the delay manually, setting it and just listening with your ear can be more effective than trying to just, put it into sync to tempo mode and get something perfect. Because what is perfect in that case? Also, when I've mixed live, when I do the Bonnaroo Hay Bale Studios, those are all like real-time mixes with artists playing. And I love the experience of having the band play and you've got a tap tempo button and you're just tapping in what you feel by hand and you can change it in the middle of a song, in the middle of a mix. You can just move it around. And that's something that I never hear people talking about much. It's like, who says you even have to set the delay level? I mean, the delay timing when you're mixing. Maybe do a pass where you're just tap tempoing the delay and adjusting knobs and you just record that.
And a lot of times, if you set up a delay in a way that's not just a preset metric division of the tempo, it's going to convey a sense of space that's very peculiar compared to the rest of the song and can really make a part sound like it's doing something very interesting. Also, there's something else I want to add, just a general concept of working. I was thinking about doing this interview this morning, and I just came up with this thought about how, like I said, people are sort of being marketed to, you need to buy this thing, or you need to try this, or, people are always calling me up and saying, oh my God, you got to hear this thing, or you got to try this thing. It's amazing what it does. And I'm very skeptical about these kinds of things. And I essentially gave up on anybody's ability to convey an experience to someone else except through art. Because your experience with something is going to be completely unique than mine is. So when somebody is really recommending something to me, I'm like, well, I'm glad they're having that experience with it. I'm not likely to have that experience that they're having with it. But I sort of thought about this idea of when somebody buys a new piece of gear or brings something into a session or introduces something to somebody, like you're working with a guitar player, oh my God, check out this stomp box, check out this pick. This is going to change your life. It can improve the session, but by one unrelated mechanism. It causes them to focus their attention. And it's interesting to note that even a small concentration of focused attention can have a tremendous effect on the results.
Absolutely.
In the medical research world, it's known as placebo effect, right? Like, we think this is going to happen, but it's kind of used, the word placebo outside of the medical profession is kind of used to like, well, you're faking it. You're really not really feeling those things, are you? But in the arts, the results are just as valid as any repeatable catalyst can be, because at the end of the day, music is only about how it makes you feel. So when you get somebody to focus their attention on something, whether it's like, check out this new plugin or try this new guitar pick, and everybody in the room goes, wow, that's really different. It's because the person who's introduced this thing into their workflow is focusing their attention on it, and they're hearing something and they're noticing something they'd never noticed before.
That's brilliant,
so I think
man.
That's a listening skill that people need to develop, is focusing your attention, which is, like I said, I did not have a smartphone or a cell phone up until about 9 months ago. So I'm not addicted to it, and I don't look at it. And people get mad at me when at the end of the day, I pick the thing up and the screen is littered with messages. And it's like, well, so I was busy.
Yeah.
My attention was elsewhere.
When I first got my cell phone and it was like binging with each email coming in, and I was like, what the hell is this? I got to turn that off as fast as possible. I was trying to work. Describe to the rock stars how you're using your cell phone now to join us for this Skype call.
So I'm forced to communicate because we're all in lockdown over the phone. I've just got the thing on a string on the case that is looped around my neck and it's hanging just below on my chest as like a lavalier mic. So,
Brilliant.
It's like a mechanical fix to a problem.
Put it right next to your heart. Wait, that doesn't sound like such a great idea.
Yeah, no.
Well, dude, it's an absolute blast hanging out with you. There's so much stuff we could geek out on. I love your attitude towards this stuff, and I love your appreciation of, the art and the craft of what we do, above the convenience even. And in fact, when you talk about introducing the element and helping it to add an element of focus, it makes me think of things like the times where I've been working with a band and we're a little lost, and then they get a new little guitar amp, and all of a sudden we're so excited by this sound, and we start creating, or a new guitar comes along, and it's like that alone causes us to get excited and focused. Or I'm going into the studio with my same band, and just the fact that I took the time to chart out the 8 songs we're going to do gets everybody focused, and all of a sudden we're way more productive than usual.
You've imbued the music with this physicality, even if it's just a chart, and you feel it in your hands when you put those charts down. You're like, that's the music, right?
Yeah.
Everyone else feels that energy from it, and they're going to put something into it, right? It's not a fake thing. I mean, it's even though it's called the placebo effect, it's not artificial. It really does matter.
Hey, if you get the result, you got the result.
Yeah, but the other thing I want to clarify about this is it's not the thing that's causing it. It's you focusing your attention.
Yeah.
And this is one of my favorite things I've heard in my life. A few years ago, I was at this meeting, and this guy said, the only thing we have any control of in our lives is where we focus our attention.
That's great.
You can't change anything in the world except where you focus your attention. And another quote I ran into recently said, you become what you focus your attention on.
Yep. This all sounds like every bit of great sort of life coaching advice, at the core of it.
It's because it's how we manage to get through, everything is just kind of like, I pick up these little phrases from people randomly. Oh my God, I had a yoga teacher the other day said the most amazing thing that I think your rock stars need to know. We were standing in a tree pose, which is where you're balancing on one foot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she said the most amazing thing that will change everybody's mixing life. She said, remember, balance is not about stillness.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because you're always compensating. When you're wavering, you're compensating. When you're working on a mix, it's not, there's the balance, that's the song. It's like, no, you're always jiggling things around to make it stand up, right?
Yep. I'm trying to do the tree pose while we finish the podcast right now. I can't remember where my hands are supposed to go.
If you hear a loud thump, that's Lidge. But the other thing this yoga teacher said the other week was, how you do anything is how you do everything.
Wow, these are deep, man. I love it.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. Well, let's close out on that. I want to make a couple of comments. I want to point out that I'm happy to say that I and you, Chuck, as far as you've told me, are both healthy and well now. As we do this interview in March during the COVID-19 lockdown. And so hopefully, rock stars, as you hear our voices, when this comes out later, it will still be the case. That's what I wish on both of us.
Yeah,
and
thanks, Lidge.
all of you listening. Love all you guys. And that's really the thing that holds the world together. So just a moment there. Let the rock stars know how they can find you online. How can they learn more about you, Chuck? And when they need to come make the record they always wanted to make and reach out to you, how should they do that?
I'm easily accessible. I once had a producer reach out to me from Nashville and said, oh my God, your phone number is in the phone book. And I said, I don't owe anybody any money. Yeah, I'm very accessible. I love talking to people about this stuff. I have, countless people that contact me to ask little questions about things, and I always welcome that because it gives me a chance to reevaluate why I think certain things or why do I feel certain ways about things. And I learn a lot from questions from other people. So you can reach me on Facebook. You can reach me on the telephone. You can reach me via email. My website is going to be there, and it has contact information on it. Yeah, it's a good thing. Reach out.
All right, man. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, Chuck. It's been an absolute blast hanging out with you, dude.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming up behind me at the AES. I'm like, that guy's voice sounds familiar.
I look forward to doing the opposite of social distancing and coming to see your studio when all this clears over. By the time this podcast's out.
Yeah, let's hope. They are telling us here that it's going to be 9 months to 18 months.
Well, we can make a lot of records in our home studios in that time.
That's true.
A lot of solo records. Actually, there's going to be some pretty cool things that people do collaborating, and I'm excited for that too.
Certainly, yeah.
All right, man. Thanks, Chuck. I look forward to seeing you in person, and we'll talk to you soon, dude.
Thank you, Lidge.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lidge Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible. OWC, JZ Microphones, PreSonus, Spectra 1964, and API Audio. You will find links to all these wonderful sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.